Airing first on Asheville FM, WSFM LP 103.3 FM, this is The Final Straw, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian radio show broadcasting out of occupied Cherokee land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world.
This week we feature 3 portions. First up, we share a chat with Lauren Regan of the Civil Liberties Defense Center, or CLDC, about safer practices around technology for activists. Following this, Withers, a new collective member at The Final Straw, shares a chat with Adam and Amy, 2 organizers from the Palm Beach Tenants Union out of Florida, about their work and the sorts of mutual aid disaster relief that they've done with Hurricane Irma and advocating for and organizing with renters in their communities for dignity and housing. Finally, you'll hear a conversation with Enid and Rebecca, 2 feminist activists in Hong Kong, about the current state of protests there. Content warning, that segment deals with, in part, with organizing around sexualized assault and violence by police and as well as civil society. The Final Straw is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts. Here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
Yeah. This is M1, M1, M de la gente comprende y entiende, you feel me? I'm one half of Dead Prez, to tell it like it is, everything is political rap duo. Here holding my middle finger up to imperialism worldwide. And you in tune right now to the Rebel Beat.
The Rebel Beat is a monthly podcast of radical political music across different genres and across different continents. It's the mixtape to a riot against police brutality. It's your nightly newscast set to bass and beats. It's protest anthems from Hong Kong to Istanbul to Ferguson to Montreal. Give it a listen at rebelbeatradio.com or subscribe today on all your favorite podcast platforms.
And now some words from anarchist prisoner Sean Swain.
What you say, what you say, what you say, what? We'll call like a
I'm not sure, but I believe we have just experienced our own extinction event. If I'm right, we're doomed. We will all be sputtering out soon. And the irony is, when this extinction event occurred, few of the 7 billion of us even seemed to care. The stock market kept right on rolling. Folks kept watching Netflix and YouTube kitten videos. We worked, we shopped, we ordered pizza. The event that I'm suggesting as our extinction event is the burning of the Amazon. The Amazon is the source of 20% or more of this planet's oxygen supply. This vast expanse of triple canopy forest acts as a kind of filter for the air. So in this regard, the Amazon is both the planet's lungs and its liver. And as of a couple weeks ago, it's well on its way to non-existence. That's really bad. Really, really bad. For the last 8,000 years, all of us humans with our big brains expanded our civilization program to every corner of the globe. We set about, as an unintended consequence, wiping out 124 species per day. That's every day. 124 species never coming back. So it stands to reason that at some point on such a trajectory, we would start killing off other life forms that we needed, life forms that were essential to our own survival. If we kill off the species we depend on for our own survival, then we kill ourselves. We're talking about mass suicide on a global level. Think about the irony in that. Here we are with our big brains, so smart that we're the only species capable of doing something this monumentally stupid. Just to be clear, when we're talking about saving the environment or saving the planet, we're not saving it from reckless alligators or the rampant overpopulation of lizards. We're talking about saving the planet from us. Us. We are the problem. We are the thing killing the planet. And if we kill it enough, we kill us. Just a quick observation here, not that it matters at this point, but I would suggest that our inability to stop killing everything doesn't make us the smartest species. Our big brains notwithstanding, we've got to be the dumbest species ever. And I think we're figuring that out way, way too late. Back in March or April, I was watching 60 Minutes. They did a story about a scientist in, I think, Siberia. He had spent decades studying the permafrost. What his research shows is that global warming melts the permafrost, and the melting of the permafrost then releases tons of greenhouse gases. That release of greenhouse gases kills the ozone even more and increases the global warming. It becomes a deadly cycle. But what he also discovered is the solution: planting trees. Lots of trees. The shade from trees slows the melting, and the trees absorb greenhouse gases. If you plant enough trees, you can, over time, reverse the cycle, maybe even giving the ozone time to potentially recover. It's kind of a no-brainer, really. Our planet used to be blue and green. The blue served its purpose, and the green served its purpose. The more green we can make our planet, in a very literal sense, the healthier it is. So last month it was quite inspiring to learn that the people of Ethiopia, in just one day, planted 350 million trees. 350 million. Pretty much the whole population of the country stopped everything they were doing for just 24 hours and planted 1/3 of 1 billion trees. Such a thing gets you to wondering what could happen if first world industrialized countries like the U.S. or China, with much larger populations, dedicated a day to planting trees. Makes you ponder what our world could be in just 10 or 20 years if we were dedicated to reversing the damage we've inflicted for 8,000 years. But then, just shortly after such a fantastically hopeful event, we torched the Amazon, and then we all stood around with hands in pockets and watched it burn. Like all delusional hierarchs, the president of Brazil viewed the inferno as an annoyance, an interruption in his efforts to make the hierarch trains run on time. So he dedicated 40,000 troops to put out the fires. As vast as the Amazon is, with 40,000 troops, that left an area twice the size of New Jersey to be saved by 3 soldiers. But at the same time, Brazil wouldn't let anyone else do anything either, calling such intrusions neo-colonialism. So thanks to hierarchs, who always think like hierarchs, and cannot grasp the desperate and irrevocable consequences of such a singular catastrophe, I suspect we have all faced our own extinction event. I think this is the thing that killed us. We're just the last ones to get the memo. So the bad news is, we're all going to sputter out, and probably relatively soon. And since the Amazon produced 20% of the planet's oxygen, the UN will have to set up a global program teaching us all to hold our breath for 4.8 hours each day. But the good news for all of us quixotic dreamers who are trying to save us from ourselves is that we're doomed. We can stop fighting and struggling for survival now. The human race is now collectively doomed, like Hillary Swank and $1 Million Baby, and all that's left is for Clint Eastwood to put us out of our misery, an overdose, or a pillow over the face. Don't fight it, just let it happen. For all of you savage cannibal maniacs out there with the ski masks and the dumpster fires, you can retire now. Catch up on what you've been missing. You can binge watch the shows you never had time for. Play some Grand Theft Auto or the reboot of World of Warcraft. Maybe start vaping. What's the difference? We can accept the inevitable. Eat cheese puffs and drink high fructose corn syrup by the gallons. Whatever we do, it makes no difference. We've jumped the shark. Of course, I'm something of a hypocrite. I won't be taking my own advice. I'll be going down swinging, and the off chance it might make a difference. Besides, I don't know how to do anything else. This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain in exile from Ohio at Buckingham Correctional in Dillwyn, Virginia. If you're ignoring the advice I just gave you, you are the resistance.
You can write to Sean Swain at his latest address at Sean Swain, number 2015638, Buckingham Correctional, P.O. Box 430, Dillwyn, Virginia, 23936. You can find his past writings, recordings of his audio segments, and updates on his case at seanswain.org, or now follow him on Twitter at @SwainRocks. Would you please introduce yourself, name and pronouns, and tell listeners about what you do at the CLDC or the Civil Liberties Defense Center?
Sure. My name is Lauren Regan. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the founder, executive director, and senior staff attorney at the Civil Liberties Defense Center. And we are a 16-year-old nonprofit organization that defends social change activists around the country. We've done everything from criminal defense of ELF and ALF folks in federal court for things like economic sabotage. And we've defended folks that have resisted grand juries, as well as slap suits. And we, represent all different stripes of activists. Right now, a lot of our work is focused on climate and anti-fascist legal support. But it's kind of spanned the gamut depending on the need of the movements.
So I'd invited you on to talk about this instance that came up in the media somewhat in the last month about the NYPD using reverse warrants, quote unquote, and geofencing via data that they got from Google in order to not only help convict some Proud Boys that were involved in attacking anti-fascist protesters, but also to collect information on the anti-fascist protesters. Can you tell a little bit about this situation?
Well, sure. I would start off by saying that law enforcement in general and intelligence agencies more broadly have been surveilling, data mining, investigating activists, political movements, et cetera, for a really long time. And they are taking advantage of information that is basically publicly available online, through social media, and other sources. And geofencing is the use of the Global Positioning System satellite network, which basically means GPS. They can also use Wi-Fi nodes or Bluetooth beacons to basically create a virtual boundary around a location. That's why they call it geofence. The fence is then paired with some kind of hardware or software application that kind of responds to that boundary depending on what is programmed. So, for instance, it could track humans coming and going across a boundary. It could track communications within or externally to that boundary. And that geofence-based program, hardware and software has been around for decades. It used to be really expensive and used, in a very limited capacity because of the cost of it. But for instance, livestock managers used geofencing in the early days of it. They'd basically put a GPS, unit on each of their cows and then basically track whether or not any cows escaped from fencing. So that, just to give you an example, is what was used at the most basic level with regard to geofencing. Now, of course, it's kind of taken on some new, kind of foreboding applications as it's being used as part of, sort of COINTELPRO style surveillance of political activists. And, I think the larger question is similar to the COINTELPRO era, where lawyers litigated whether or not the government was violating the constitutional rights of political activists by spying on them for their above ground political organizing. The courts during that era came out and said that that was unconstitutional and that the government shall not engage in surveillance of political activists just in and of themselves. And we all recognize, of course, that COINTELPRO really never ended. That has continued since that time period, despite the fact that the courts ruled it to be unconstitutional. But it's kind of had a resurgence, in recent years. And I think, in large part due to some of the exposure that whistleblowers, provided to the public about ways in which the government is illegally spying on its citizenry. And, geofencing is just one of those examples. The law says that the government, can go get a search warrant and can investigate a person if they believe that the person is involved in criminal activity. And criminal activity can include, quote unquote, conspiracy, so that very broad common net that the government tries to, drape over, whole movements, claiming that, the definition of conspiracy is just two or more individuals that do anything in furtherance of a crime. And so, that's obviously a really wide definition. And so often we'll see the FBI or some other law enforcement agency applying for the authority to surveil and investigate people who are just sort of like broadly members of a movement or an organization, and they claim that authority based on quote unquote conspiracy, which doesn't really amount to much, but at least they're going through some process and they're attempting to cloak themselves in legal legitimacy. But at other times, basically what intelligence agencies are claiming is that they are allowed to use the public domain just like anyone else. And if, your Aunt Betty can go on Facebook and monitor your political theories and communications, then so can law enforcement. And that is by and large what we've seen the majority of law enforcement agencies using, is just sort of trolling Facebook and and other social media apps and gleaning names, contact information, who's mad at who's dating who, photographs, which of course Facebook photographs include facial recognition as part of them. So it's actually a very high quality photo for law enforcement to use. And then, of course, every once in a while, like in this New York City situation, it is exposed that they're using some kind of corporate proprietary software to enhance their ability to surveil. And I think, the $1 million question is, what is the lawful basis for using something that captures both legal and, potentially suspect communications or actors, in this way. And, I think from a practical standpoint, what our digital security people, have discussed with me is, geofencing in this capacity has a lot of problems because it literally creates sort of a needle in a haystack situation where it is able to suck up so much that it makes it really difficult for anything to be used in an immediate and meaningful way. However, the problem, the concern is that this type of data collection can be saved for forever, and so maybe they don't get around to going through every, cell phone GPS, match that occurs. But down the road, if they get suspicious on a particular person and are able to obtain that person's cell phone number, then they can go through that data collection, in a more careful manner, looking for a particular phone number or particular identity.
So I guess that's a term, like they use the term false discovery in the case of the information that they gather up that isn't useful for them in whatever case in like the geofencing scenarios. It's interesting that you bring up the COINTELPRO, I mean, because that's it's an ever present and looming reality that the government does counterintelligence, does counterinsurgency, tries to undermine people's relationships with each other, surveils, does social networking, mapping, and such. But yeah, now that these companies are the terrain has changed, with the Church Committee, a FISA court was created that forced the FBI and law enforcement to go through a process of attaining a warrant to be able to wiretap. But now telephony is such a funny idea with people using VoIP, with us conferencing not directly over a phone line at the moment also. So those relationships with the corporations that are actually containing the information that people, the ways that people communicate, Facebook as a private corporation, Google as a private corporation, Apple, is there any limitation to, or any sort of legalized relationship that they have with law enforcement? Is there a process that law enforcement actually has to go through to attempt to attain information in these manners, as far as you know?
Well, it depends. With Facebook, anything that is set to a public setting is available to anyone, including cops without any kind of subpoena, search warrant, etc. The general rule is if the general public could access it, then cops can access it without any additional hoops to jump through. And it is my understanding from our digital security folks that there are just a ton of settings that most Facebook users don't even know exist. One of our digital security people was doing some experiments with a Facebook account that they set up in their own name, and realized that 70% of the privacy settings available he didn't even know about, and literally were left on the default setting of public. So, for people who are using Facebook, you really need to, if you're going to use it, which we jokingly call it face crack. But if you're going to use Facebook, you need to invest the time in actually going through all of the privacy settings and learning what they are and turning them on. That being said, normally what you would expect is that the state would have to provide Facebook or, some other corporate platform with a warrant or a subpoena or a national security letter in order to obtain information from the quote unquote private side, of those accounts. And just to be clear, when I say that private side, you can shut down your Facebook account, but everything related to that account remains available on the back side of the platform. And so when law enforcement gets a warrant or subpoena or a national security letter, it includes everything that you deleted from your account. So it's not publicly available anymore. Nobody on the front side can see it, but it's all absolutely still accessible on the back end, unfortunately. The other concern that digital security advocates have voiced about Facebook and Google and, some of these other big ones is that they have really cozy, as corporations, they have somewhat cozy relationships with law enforcement and with the state. They certainly are not going to go to jail resisting a grand jury subpoena for your records. So when you're choosing digital communications, you need to think about who owns it, who holds it, and what their motivations or loyalties may be, because ultimately you have to trust them with everything that you post there. And if you don't trust them, you probably should not be posting it there. But that is, technically how it's supposed to go. And, the other caveat I'll just make is with national security letters, Google or Facebook are specifically informed that they cannot disclose that they've received that letter, what the contents of it were, and what they ended up turning over. One of our digital security coordinators, who is a computer scientist at Oregon State University, published and does research tracking, Google and these other platforms and the types and quantities of warrants, subpoenas, voluntary turnovers, all sorts of things like this. She actually tracks them and reports on them. And it's pretty amazing how many of these corporate platforms will just voluntarily turn over your private information upon a verbal or written request with no further, subpoena or legal process involved in it.
A lot of what you've been pointing to, like they definitely have the information. If someone has or I usually call it FedBook instead of FaceCrack, but so they're collecting information on these social media platforms, for instance, that you decide to put in things that you are publicly trying to share with other people, maybe chats that you're having with other individuals in a more closed setting. However, there's also all of this other information, the information that people who are trying to be careful with their like digital cookie crumb trail can't help but leave behind. What Wi-Fi they're connecting to, what towers they're near, the monitors that are on your phone that inform the phone of your like state of activity and engagement. If it's, if there's light coming in through the camera, if the phone is being handled, if it's being warmed by your body heat. This is another like extra frightening thing about the incident and the police's use of, the new information that comes out more publicly about what the police do with the data that is being tracked at all times. Because if simply being adjacent to an incident that occurs, but not being caught on any camera, but your cell phone provider gives up the information to law enforcement that you were geolocated to be in a certain place, that is frightening, right? If they can go backtrack that information, like you said, later, if they just keep it in an archive and pull that up to try to map your movements, your sleeping patterns, not to sound too like paranoid, but I think this should be kind of a wake-up call that it's not just about the information that you're giving up. It's the information that's constantly being collected by these devices that we keep in our pockets.
Yeah, I mean, and one thing I would add to that, especially with regard to social media, which Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, like all of these things that, most people are using all the time. The other major component, and to me, the more troubling aspect of this type of data collection is, that its primary purpose when it was first developed and as it's currently being used is to track networks. So, the family tree, so to speak, who knows who and who works with who and, who is working on, Palestine human rights versus, climate change or whatnot. That information, the network information, is a lot of what we see in FOIA documents right now from FBI, as well as these private spy agencies, because a lot of what they are attempting to do is psychologically profile the movement. They are looking at who is involved, how are people being recruited or motivated to come join you, how are you picking targets, what language are you using in your narrative? And not only are they using this information to try to preempt you to, according to COINTELPRO language, to disrupt your ability to successfully organize, they're also, looking for the Achilles heels. They're looking for the weak points, the pinch points. They're looking for, how can they sow division? For instance, like out at Standing Rock, we saw in FOIA documents and other records that Tiger Swan and law enforcement, which was federal, state, military, the whole 9 yards, were monitoring the situation and specifically documented that there were tensions between white and indigenous organizers and that they wanted to exploit race issues as a way to try and implode the success of that movement. And so, don't underestimate, the state is not really super interested in who broke the law and whether a crime was committed. Right now they are, very focused on figuring out ways to take you down in larger scale when and if they decide that is necessary or effective for them to do. So a lot of people, when we talk about social media, they will respond by saying like, oh, I'm only posting things that, are public, that are events or, blah, blah, blah. And that's fine. But you have to realize that it's not really the content of what you post that is necessarily being spied on. It's who receives it and what they do with it and who they send it on to, et cetera, et cetera. And you posting some flyer about a Know Your Rights training may not be concerned about the state knowing that, but there could be much more vulnerable or marginalized people that are in your network that, receive extra heat and extra scrutiny, as a result of that we all kind of need to be cognizant about. I think the old adage that we are only as strong as our weakest link really comes home to roost with regard to digital security and surveillance, because, one person posting my photo on Facebook provides the state with a facially recognized digital version of me, even though I don't even have a Facebook account.
Yeah. But I mean, the state also has access to your driving, assuming you have an ID with the state, like the law enforcement has access to that information anyway in databases, right?
There are a million ways that they can, get digital photographs, certainly. On the other point that you were mentioning, our digital security trainers, often will say, there is no such thing as 100% security or 100% trust, but there are small things that we can all do to make it more difficult for the state to spy on us. For instance, using a Faraday bag for your cell phone. A Faraday bag basically just interrupts the ability of the phone to communicate with cell towers, satellites, et cetera, especially because most of our phones nowadays, even if you turn them off, the GPS still works, and many of the other biometrics that you mentioned are still effective. But allegedly, using things like Faraday bags or, these sort of RFID preventative wallets that, are being sold, some of those things can make it more difficult for the state to easily acquire that type of information from you.
So in terms of the Faraday bag, and I for any listeners that are familiar with the concept of wearing a tinfoil hat, it's an ineffective application of the same technology, but it's actually like this is the same idea, creating a barrier that either internally the signals that are being sent out from a device hit this and radiate back and aren't able to penetrate and get out to what they're trying to connect to, or from the outside, the signals not being able to reach this specific device. I allegedly have a Faraday bag also.
And you have to test them out.
Yeah.
Like our tech geeks tell us, don't just buy into the marketing and assume it's going to work. You need to actually test it.
So there's certain things that you can test for. You can turn it on, have it receiving signal. You can call it from another device, see if you can hear it ring or if it turns on, if it has a window, in the bag. You can try to send it an email, see if it gets signal over Wi-Fi. You can, there's any number of different things that you can try to ping it with. But I wonder, there's also all of these other forms of signal that aren't visible to us that it's communicating, such as GPS. Like, even if you turn off location surfaces or whatever, I have no way of knowing that it's not actually pinging a tower nearby. Is there an effective, is there a brand that your tech researchers would suggest, or an effective review site, or any sort of other way to know that people have actually tested something like a Faraday bag, or an RFID blocking wallet or slip, for these, like, for all the many spectrum of signals that are, communicating through these devices?
Yeah, I mean, I know our digital security team has been working with the folks at EFF, Electronic Frontier Foundation, and I believe that EFF actually was selling a Faraday bag that they had vetted and were recommending and kind of selling it as merch. And I know that we were also looking into testing and basically obtaining a solid version of things to also share with our audience and supporters, and I think that is underway. The problem with it is you have to constantly be retesting it, because just because in 2018 you buy a Faraday bag and it works doesn't mean that the version that they are providing to you in 2019 is the same exact one. So we're really hesitant to put out this is safe for you to use statements, because there's just so many variables that are constantly changing in that regard. I do know that, like, for people who use Macs and iPhones, we actually will use that Find My iPhone app to try and test, Faraday bags and barriers like that. And that has seemed to, work pretty well in sussing out the fakes from legitimate.
Yeah, and I think a lot of Android phones have something similar on it that you could probably test with too. So there's a really interesting article, and I haven't, I don't know if you've seen it or not, but it was published, I think, about 9 months ago, and it's called Never Turn Off the Phone. Have you seen that?
I haven't.
Okay. It was up on some of the sketchier sites like 325.NoState and Act for Freedom and stuff like that. But it sort of goes through the process of trying to raise awareness in the reader's mind of, like, the sociality of how we interact with the device. Like I was mentioning with, the biometric features, it detecting motion, it detecting light coming in through the camera, and it's sort of like phones being used to sort of keep track of or providing an outlet for somebody to be able to keep track of sleeping patterns, regular cafes that people go to, or like routes people take to work on a regular basis, just sort of like engineering patterns that people engage with the idea of people sometimes will go to a protest or whatever and they'll turn off their phone, or they'll have a conversation that they don't want to be recording and they turn off their phone, or they leave it in a place, that they wouldn't leave it normally. And if someone was trying to track that information, like trying to see, like check a device, do one of these reverse warrants, to get information about, like, what was the activity of this device during this period of time, that would show a disruption of the normal pattern that somebody would go through, which would sort of raise some flags. So I wonder, and this is kind of it's a weird direction of question, but are there any suggestions that you or the tech experts at CLDC have in terms of how to relate to devices? Like, I mean, my first and action, like, my first thought is leave your phone at home, like, rather than going to a demonstration to protest Nazis. Like, don't have it on you, and then it can't get taken. If you were someone who just got caught up, for instance, in the J20 arrests and happened to have your phone on you, a number of phones were taken, a number of them were unencrypted and were unlocked, and law enforcement was able to pull whatever information they wanted off of those.
Right, which, there's levels to that. I would say, number one, ideally people who are showing up to protests are aware enough to put a password on their cell phone, which would make it that much more difficult for the state to access, that kind of information. That's just sort of a basic, a basic thing. I guess, the details of how technology is going to change and be used against us, is a constant evolving situation. But there are a few sort of foundational things that I think it's important to remember. Number one, historically and currently, if you need total security for something, a face-to-face conversation in the woods is still going to be likely, your best security. However, it's only as strong as the other person, listening to it. So if you confess, a story to someone and they turn around and either are a cop or, provide it to the cops, then, that's no security. But there are definitely, some advantages to the old school ways that should not be entirely forgotten in this generation of like entirely digital oriented people. So I think that's one thing. But the other overarching thing that I would just remind your listeners is that state repression like this has been around forever. The Black Panthers faced assassinations by the state. And repression is just a way to try to scare people into submission and scare them into just not doing anything at all and letting the state have the run of the land. And so, you don't want to get people so freaked out about this technology that they think that they cannot, take to the streets or stand up for what they believe in. Because if we get to that point, then sort of like the panopticon, the state doesn't even have to do anything. We all act as if we are being surveilled all the time. And we act as if the state has far more power over, we the people than they actually do. Because no matter how much surveillance and, and security, devices are used against us, they can't catch us all. They can't round us all up. And, overall, I would say that when you see repression ratcheting up in this type of way, it's normally because the movements are becoming stronger and they're actually more of a viable threat to the state and its capitalist systems. And so I think we need to really balance taking ourselves seriously and learning what we can and preventing giving easy access to the state for this type of information, but at the same time also recognizing that you're a target because you're doing good work and, the state wouldn't bother with you if there wasn't a reason for them to be paying attention. So, be smart, be safe, but also be really effective because that's really what is needed as the clock ticks down on, the time left to actually make significant, change to the climate or, these other kind of looming threats right now.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And we shouldn't let ourselves be affected by the attempted chilling effect by especially visible surveillance as it comes. But as the EFF says, security, self-defense, for instance, is a state of mind more than an actual technology. It's a relationship to the devices around us. And so I think it's important to be informed and to also be aware of what we're doing with these things that are in our hands, like not knowing exactly what they can do, being conscientious of like how we relate to them and what we put through them in a way that is constantly, like, the technology is constantly shifting. There's always new apps. There's new like social media platforms to engage with. But I think that also if we don't have like a critical mindset of what those technologies are doing, sort of, and try to build a culture that holds attention right there. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, so I became a lawyer because my friends were getting arrested and were having bad experiences with criminal defense lawyers. And I saw this like specific niche that the movement needed, and I dedicated myself to that niche. And I feel like in the digital security realm, we really need the same thing. And part of why CLDC created a digital security for activists program was, there were a few organizations that were kind of taking that on, but not necessarily with like the same movement connections that we had. And we feel like, we always the movement is going to need specialty experts that are going to be constantly researching, diving deep, learning and understanding all of these types of things that affect the work we do. And then they need to be able to instruct and relay that information to us in a timely basis so that we can integrate it into our work, and it allows us to be more strategic. The analogy, like we give all these know your rights trainings to activists. And part of it is we want activists to know where the legal landmines are so that they can try and work around them and still come up with a campaign that, reaches their goal, gets them, the goods that they're after. And so, I don't think that any single organizer or activist can hold all of this in their head to the high level that is currently required, in society. But we need to, build trusted relationships across the movement, which often means face-to-face friendships, meetings, et cetera, to build that level of trust. And then we need to be able to rely on those networks and the circle of trust to move all of our work forward.
Can you tell a little bit about what y'all offer in terms of digital security and how folks can access that?
Sure. Yeah, we regularly do digital security for activists trainings. In fact, this weekend, we're going to be in Oakland on Sunday doing a big digital security for activists training. We do many of them as webinars. Our crew prefers to do them in person so that they can actually walk around and help people with screens. And, again, that face-to-face, relationship, even for a digital security training, is still really important. But we do them as webinars to try and reach as many people as possible. If you go on our website, I know there are like abundant listings for a variety of different digital security trainings that are already on the calendar, but people can also reach out to our digital security team. If you are working with a collective or an organization, they will do sort of like a digital security audit. What are your threats? What are your vulnerabilities? And then help you come up with a security plan that is geared toward the work you're actually doing. If you're putting on a bake sale for, autistic children, you probably don't need to be using Tor, VPNs, and Faraday bags. So you try to individualize the digital security plan according to the threat assessment that you conduct, and they will help you do that kind of audit and help you come up with that kind of plan if your organization needs that too. And you can, our website is cldc.org, and through there you can contact the digital security team, and they will, respond and set things up if you want it.
Well, Lauren, is there anything that I didn't ask about that in this vein that you want to talk about?
Well, I guess I will just, mention that this is not the type, whether it's know your rights for activists or digital security for activists, it's not something that you can do once and think that you don't have to check back on it, for another year or two. things are changing in that legal landscape and that digital security landscape. And as a result, activists are coming up with all sorts of workarounds and, protective mechanisms and other things that they're trying to share. At the same time, they're really not wanting to share them online, because that's part of the problem. So I think, a challenge right now is for our movements to be able to disseminate information and communicate effectively without relying on the same problematic technologies that we are, kind of calling out and pointing out the problems in. So, we currently are members of May 1st, which is a group of activists that are providing websites, email. They're even working up an alternative to Zoom or Facebook or some of these other things called Jitsi. And these are startup projects that have been developed by us, by our movements, with our ethics and, and concerns in mind. And those types of collectives really need our support. If we want an alternative to Facebook, if we want an alternative to Zoom, then we are going to need to build that within our movements from the ground up. Those, entities, FaceCrack, et cetera, are millions and billions of dollars worth of, startup costs. And our activist friends are, doing it on a shoestring. So, if digital security, communications are of interest to you, I would strongly suggest checking them out and supporting their work as well.
And that's May 1st spelled out, like May1st.org, is that right?
Yeah.
Cool. I hadn't heard about this. Maybe this will, if people are listening to this and they do have tech skills or whatever, is this the kind of thing that they can bring to the fore and bring to this project?
Yeah, they are a member-owned organization, a non-hierarchical movement. They call themselves the May 1st Movement Technology. When we first explored switching over to them, I actually called the developers. They had a conversation with me where I specifically was asking them, if you get a grand jury subpoena for CLDC records, what are you going to do? And their response was, go to jail. So they are very aligned politically with the left, as their name sort of, notes. And they've been very, very open with our digital security team. In fact, I think one of our security team members is potentially going to be on their board sometime soon. So they are a great organization. And yeah, it's May1st.org is their website. Definitely check them out. And if you are an organization, they host Planned Parenthood's website, Black Lives Matter website. Like they have been incredible in terms of preventing attacks and hacks and DNS, attacks and things like that. They are hosting, high caliber organizations that are just constantly under attack and under threat. And they have been doing a fantastic job of protecting, their websites and their digital communications. So far they've been a great organization to work with. Cool.
Well, Lauren, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been very educational, and I hope that people follow y'all and pay attention to the important work that you're doing. This is The Final Straw Radio, and I'm Bursts. You just heard our chat with Lauren Regan of the CLDC. More resources from this great project can be found at cldc.org. To hear the other half of our chat, check out our podcast version. It gets kind of wingnutty. Next up, Withers talks to Adam and Amy of Palm Beach Tenants Union about disaster relief and preparedness in southeast of Turtle Island. More on the union at pbctu.org, or you can get involved in mutual aid up at Mutual Aid Disaster Relief. There are a series of donation sites around this region that you can find listed up there, or you can search on social media for either Mutual Aid Disaster Relief Matter or Mutual Aid Disaster Distro.
Speaking with Adam and Amy. Adam is the founder of the Palm Beach Tenants Union, and Amy is the current co-chair. Thank you both so much for taking the time to talk with me today. First of all, where are you?
Kind of all over Palm Beach County. So multiple cities, Riviera Beach, Lake Worth, Boynton Beach, all over.
And can you describe a little bit about the work of the Palm Beach Tenants Union?
The work of the Palm Beach Tenant Union is pretty much self-explanatory. It's a tenants union where the tenants are able to voice their concerns in their different neighborhoods, things that they have experienced dealing with landlords, and they need someone to be able to hear them and come up with a plan, come up with a process of dealing with their landlord before going to the courts or just moving away. There's just certain things that a landlord is obligated to do because the tenant is paying rent. So we just want to make sure that the tenants are comfortable in their dwelling, and if there's any issues that come up, then we can address them. And if we need to write letters, if we need to, go to the actual dwellings or wherever they live and, be an advocate for them, that's what we're for.
How long has the union been around?
We've actually been around since the last hurricane that hit us, Hurricane Irma, which I was going to touch on with some of our mutual aid, relief work. But yeah, we actually formed in the aftermath of Hurricane Irma in 2017, so about exactly 2 years ago.
Can you talk a little bit about that process of getting started and how you decided to form the union?
Yeah, what happened during Irma is, what's happening during a lot of the storms in Florida. Tenants are experiencing a lot of landlord issues. The landlord uses mandatory evacuation as a pretext for evicting lots of tenants and doesn't allow a lot of landlords don't allow tenants to board up their windows or put up shutters, much less even provide shutters or boards. And once the tenants return after the storm, after the evacuation, a lot of places are devastated, so repairs aren't made fast enough and, can't get back into their properties destroyed. And landlords kind of take their time with the repairs. And so, there's just a lot of issues that come along with storms. So those were a lot of the issues we were hearing about during Hurricane Irma. Doing relief work in Lake Worth here in Palm Beach County. We were doing relief work in the heavy, Guatemalan community in Lake Worth, and we were hearing about all of those issues. So we decided to start holding tenant Know Your Rights workshops with legal aid. And from there, we formed a core group that decided to organize a tenant union. It was made up of some activists, people who've been around in activism, but quite a few, who were tenant leaders in their community and not conventional activists or not seasoned activists. So that was the core group that formed the tenant union.
Can you talk a little bit about some of the things that you've learned going through Irma a couple of years ago and the storm since, and how that's affecting your preparation process?
With Irma, we realized, especially with organizing with a lot of tenants since then, that folks in unsafe housing are obviously, the ones who bear the brunt of the storm. And so tenants like at Stony Brook, where we organized during the last storm, although we hadn't gotten into that community yet, they had, during Irma, which although it wasn't that hard, still it blew 2 roofs off of the buildings. The rain poured into exposed electrical circuits, causing a fire. 70 tenants were displaced during that storm. And just experiencing organizing in communities like that. Since then, we've seen that, even smaller rainstorms here tend to cause destruction for tenants and expose them to dangers. So, since we specifically focus on organizing in communities and helping communities organize that we target our efforts towards these communities where organizing is already happening and where we're supporting that organizing that's happening, and target our relief efforts towards those communities. And that kind of goes with what our whole idea of mutual aid is. We have minimal resources, minimal numbers, so we want to concentrate our efforts onto actual organizing that's going on, to actually aid organizers, tenant leaders, people who need backup, to continue to have the time and freedom and ability to organize their own communities. So that's kind of how our approach to mutual aid took place. As far as relief preparation during Irma, it was kind of a last minute thing that just got, thrown up together. Trying to prepare more in advance compared to the last storm and raise funds and get ready, especially because Dorian looked like it was going to be so catastrophic. So we started working to get more prepared in advance and to target our relief efforts more to tenant communities where we've organized.
Totally. So what does that look like this week? What kind of work are you doing in preparation for the storm?
Well, Dorian already passed us. So it actually, we were thinking a Category 5 storm that's coming our way is going to be a complete catastrophe for Stony Brook compared to look at what's happened before. Like in January of this year, it rains for a few days and 2 roofs cave in on different buildings. And so seeing that, we're like, this storm is going to completely destroy this neighborhood. So we were preparing as much in advance, thinking this Category 5 is going to come directly at us. So right now we haven't been preparing any relief right now at this moment because the storm already passed. But especially if more things start coming our way, we'll, get those relief efforts up and going once again. But so far in the week before the storm was coming, we were raising funds for the Stony Brook Tenant Union to have their own tenant organization to aid in whatever things were needed after the storm.
So I'd like to hear a little bit more about the vision that you mentioned for mutual aid and relief work that you hold. It sounds like a certain amount of the work that you've done has been reactionary, like when there's a catastrophe, like a natural disaster or a building that has extreme disrepair. But what does the work look like outside of hurricane season? What kind of organizing do you find yourselves doing? Can you just get a little bit more into, like I said, that vision that you hold and how that plays out in times that aren't looking like crisis?
Yeah, I think this is something Amy and I can both touch on. Most of our work is well outside of hurricane relief effort. Most of our stuff is mutual aid within and without of the group.
Well, like Adam, we deal with Stony Brook as well as other organizations, Boynton Bay. Whatever situations arise, we try to come in and see what we can do to lend a helping hand. We had some issues with different developments, and we're just here to help. So we did a GoFundMe for Stony Brook, and we got a good response. We were hoping we wouldn't need the funds, but now that we have the funds, we really want to chat to them and see what we can do to try and lighten the load of, the horrible situation they're in right now with different situations and circumstances. Yeah, we're pretty much here for each other. We're pretty much here to support each other. The tenant union is really based on helping each other. And the tenants we serve, the groups, the different developments that we serve and come in contact with that need our help.
We have tenant leaders in multiple neighborhoods who are part of the tenant union, and the whole philosophy, I guess, is to come to each other's back, whether we need somebody who needs help moving or needs, a letter written or needs legal counsel or needs anything. It could be a ladder or whatever. just that, we try to help each other with whatever resources we possibly can. And that applies to, since we've organized in multiple neighborhoods, that those, like a neighborhood like Boynton Bay might come to support a neighborhood like Holiday Park, which is a mobile home park where we organize in. And so, yeah, it's really about building bonds of solidarity between neighborhoods where we work in and to have each other's back through their struggles against their landlord, which are ongoing. And that's, most of the work I feel like we do, it could be small things like coming to, like with Amy, when she was being evicted, she had housing court kind of thing with the housing authority. Could be like going to attend their, court session or something.
And also with Miss Deidre, she moved out of her situation. She was, she wasn't happy where she was, and then she found a new spot, and, she just was tired of fighting the landlord with different issues. So we helped her move. We got moving trucks. We loaded her up, her old thing, from her old place, and we took her to a new place, with all her things and everything. And she really much appreciated, the fact that we got the truck. We got her things out of one spot and got her into her new dwelling and, helped her with her different things, to put it organized. And she liked that, she just needed that help, just being a single young lady. Well, she's an older lady, and she can't code a lot of stuff and try and rearrange her room and this, that, and other. We was able to help her rearrange her room and, get her things organized before we left. And also with Miss Brenda, she's another older young lady. She needed a ladder. She needed help getting her shutters up. At the last minute, we were going to help her with her shutters, but at the last minute, her coworker said that they would help her with her shutters. Little things like that. Just being there for each other, having each other's back. And, then as we, are there for each other, then, we can spread the word and tell others, okay, if you have a family member or whatever that need help, let us know. We're there for them as well. You know what I mean? It's just like a family. We've created, the Palm Beach Tenant Union has become a family now that lives in different spots. I'm in West Palm Beach. Miss Brenda is in Riviera. Miss Deidre is in Lake Worth. So we got, people, spread abroad in different places, but we're, we still can meet up and take care of things that need to be tended to.
How many tenants are represented by the union?
I can say, because we have official dues-paying membership, which is like 30, but, we obviously have tenant leaders who represent larger neighborhoods who aren't dues-paying members. So that's like kind of hard to say exactly how many are represented. But we organize in large neighborhoods, like Stony Brook has like 200 units. Holiday Park has like 80 mobile trailers, I think. Yeah. And similar, like 100, 200 unit apartments where we organize with the tenant associations there. And really, the general union usually includes, the leadership of these groups. And to add to what Amy is saying with mutual aid is we have the mutual aid within the group, which I feel like gives us a different composition. It allows and makes it to where we have a much more working class composition, and we're able to provide some level of support that gives us the more ability and freedom to organize within our neighborhood. It's like one thing to support coming up to a protest. It's another thing to provide ongoing solidarity and day-to-day support that keeps these grassroots leaders on their feet and able to keep up the fight, which I think is missing in a lot of cases, like mutual aid as an organizing tool, not just an end unto itself. So that's how I feel like we approach mutual aid.
I mean, when you first started, you mentioned that tenants have been having a hard time negotiating with landlords about things that seem basic to the outside perspective, like being able to cover up your windows in the case of a big storm. Have you seen any examples of attitude change from the landlords in terms of being more willing to work with the tenants now that the union is formed?
That's a hard one. I don't feel like we ever get the willing cooperation, or even unwilling cooperation of the landlords. I feel like we have to bring the hammer down on them to get anything to happen. Especially in Florida, I feel like, landlords are more transit than maybe in other places, maybe not, but it's how it feels. We have gotten some victories, but they had to come through bringing lawyers in and, spreading a rent strike and, really bringing direct action and agitation and a lot of things to the table to make it happen, such as, again, we have multiple neighborhoods. Stony Brook's a good example because we got a few wins there. But spread a rent strike, we got them, really good legal representation by Malik Lay, who's, I think is a pretty radical attorney. And we helped get the property manager fired. We got a lot of tenants. We got code in there to condemn 50 units, and we got a lot of tenants relocated into hotels and safe housing from there. Of course, the neighborhood is still in awful conditions in spite of, probably a year and a half of agitation and organizing there. The way we look at it when it comes to the immediate, it's one thing for the immediate reforms in material conditions. Our, real thing here is to really, build and help folks organize power on their own terms to really take power in their communities, which is a lot of leadership training, a lot of building and just ongoing solidarity and education and training and just all the things that come with that. So I feel like that is our main long-term goal, to build up stewards of the working class who really can lead and organize their communities and begin to govern their communities on their own terms. So I know that's kind of your question, but to just slightly answer your question and then redirect it a little.
And just for folks to better understand the situation that you're working with, are there laws in Florida that protect tenants?
And there are, but the courts side with landlords so much that if you don't, and for the most part, tenants can't even afford lawyers. When they do, they get legal aid, and legal aid is, their first go-to is to, create a compromise with the landlord and, take the easier route out, at least in our experience. So unless you have a really good attorney like we got for Stony Brook, it's really hard to enforce your rights whatsoever. So there are some things, you can legally withhold rent. There are a few things landlords have to give, 12-hour notice. So, there's a whole Florida Landlord Tenant Act. It's Act 83, where it lists tenant rights. So we encourage tenants to know their rights and to act collectively. I shouldn't say you need a really good lawyer. It helps to have a really good lawyer, but to act collectively and have a really good lawyer is usually a good recipe for enforcing any of those rights. So in our experience, courts side with landlords, and that's one way how we try to encourage folks to form a tenant union.
If folks would like to support the work that you do or get involved in any way, where would you direct them?
We've directed a lot to GoFundMe.
If they want to get directly involved, they can go on our Facebook page, Palm Beach County Tenants Union. They can also email us, pbtenantsunion@gmail.com. So, folks want to get directly hands-on involved in the group's organizing efforts. Contacting us directly through our email or messaging our Facebook page. They can also call us at 414-909-9186.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. Is there anything else that you want people to know?
The condition of Stony Brook has gotten worse, and they need immediate help. One of the tenants takes pictures of mice running around. The mice infestation mice and mold infestation at Stony Brook has really gotten out of hand, and these people need help. I mean, immediate help. It's a crying shame.
So the need that you face and work on with the union, that need doesn't go away because the storm went around you?
No, it don't.
Not at all. I mean, there's, like I said, if, even a flash storm that comes in for like a day or two could cause like roofs to cave in. Like I said, we work in a mobile home park. They're very vulnerable as well. Housing safety is an ongoing issue. And it doesn't need a Cat 5 storm either. And, there's obviously, besides the destruction, there's fires from, landlord neglect. And then besides the ongoing occasional crises that break out, like fires or roofs caving in, there's rats, roaches, sewage backup, and various things that cause, toxic mold that causes, kids to have respiratory issues. Various things, so it's ongoing crisis, and, hurricanes just tend to intensify those crises, but we're doing ongoing solidarity.
This is the Final Straw Radio and M Bursts. You just heard Adam and Amy of the Palm Beach Tenants Union. Next up, Enid and Rebecca speak about their experience of ongoing demonstrations in Hong Kong. Content warning, we will end up talking about sexualized violence by police. So I'm joined by a couple of comrades from Hong Kong to further educate us about what's been going on with the movement there. Would you care to introduce yourselves and give your pronouns? Pseudonyms are fine. Are you part of any organization that you want to name or political tendency?
My name is Enid. I can say I'm a cultural worker. I work in the arts. And I'm not really affiliated with any organization, but I've been part of the movement in various ways. So I think I could maybe contribute a little on what I've seen or what I think about it so far.
And my name is Rebecca. I go by she, her, and
me too.
And I'm also not really part of any fixed organization. I guess I identify as a feminist, but I've been sort of weaving in and out via activities with different groups involved in the movement in different ways. Anything from also participating in protests on the ground, but as well as working in translation a little bit, or small other kind of interventions and actions.
As I understand, tensions and street presence have been on a steady increase as China continued ramping up threats of possible military intervention. And there's been instances of like police provocateurs that were caught a few times attempting to discredit protests and weaken public support. Like there's that one picture that I saw an article that actually ACOC passed me that was of someone throwing a Molotov at a demonstration, and then you could see like their sidearm kind of come up underneath their shirt. But this seems like a pretty popular thing for law enforcement to do in different scenarios to discredit popular movements. Where are things at now that Hong Kong's chief executive, Carrie Lam, has officially retracted the extradition bill? Like where's the movement at and the popular sentiment?
So as we are speaking right now, there are multiple clashes across Hong Kong. I think just before we started the call, Prince Edward Station is still closed. That is the same station that saw the horror of the police raiding trains and catching not just protesters but regular citizens on the night of August 31st. And even after Carrie Lam's announcement of the full withdrawal, I think people are still very mad about what's happened throughout the past 3 months, and simple full withdrawal is not enough for us. I think the main concern right now is to really look into setting up an independent commission of police inquiry to look into police brutality and to investigate individual brutality cases. And she has, again, stated that that will not happen. Although I think she appointed 2 new investigators into an already existing organization.
I think it's called the Independent Police Commission, something like this.
The IPCC is supposed to be an independent organization that should fulfill that role of overseeing police activities and whether they cross the line. But currently, I think most of the people who run that organization are pro-Beijing or have that kind of tendency. So the citizens, they don't have trust in that organization. So that is why we demand for a completely new independent commission to be set up. But this demand, which is the number 2 of the 5 demands, have always, ever since this whole movement started, it has been continually ignored. And I think this is the focus of our current demands right now after the full withdrawal.
It's also crucial to note that this full withdrawal is, I would say it's almost a farce because in the first place, the Legislative Council is not in session now and will not return into session until October. So whatever she says now doesn't really change anything at all from when she said the bill is dead in June. And the bill is dead. At that point in time, Carrie Lam had already claimed that that was enough of a withdrawal, and people did not accept that, and therefore it became one of the 5 major demands. But now that she says this withdrawal, it has no further backing because there is no council in session in order to actually change anything. So it's really kind of a stalling. I would say she's buying time again, and most people are completely not satisfied and consider this move just really too little of a response and also too late.
Mm-hmm. So there's a Twitter user named Hong Kong Hermit, and he casually put out a post saying that he wanted to do a poll of reactions of Hong Kong citizens after the announcement of the withdrawal, and it sort of blew up into this massive poll of around, I think, 140,000 responses or votes. And out of that, I think 82% so far has made their wills clear that they wanted all 5 demands met. So this full withdrawal will not satisfy these people at all.
Of course, this is an informal survey just done by a citizen on Twitter. Mm-hmm. But generally, I think we're already kind of moving into your second question a little bit in terms of the public grievances and sort of general response, is that I actually have been quite moved because I have never seen such solidarity in Hong Kong before this. And many would say, of course, this was also one of the reasons why the Occupy, the umbrella movement, in 2014 was considered probably also generally acknowledged as a failure. And there were sort of many different factions fighting amongst one another. And I think you also already spoke about it last week about the sort of development, or I guess the change in this protest being, and this movement being highly decentralized. And so in conjunction with that decentralization, actually, and perhaps the reason why it is able to sort of still be effective to a certain degree is because there is such solidarity.
So to recap the 5 demands, the first one, which we've already achieved, is the full withdrawal,
really, but
or quote unquote, yes. Carrie Lam stated that they are going to fully withdraw the bill once the council meets again after their hiatus. And the second one is to release all arrested protesters and not prosecute them. The third one is to set up the Independent Commission of Inquiry into police brutality. The fourth is to abandon the terminology or the definition of this movement as riot. And fifth is for universal suffrage, and so that we can elect chief executive with popular vote. There's always been 5 major demands, but one of the demands has changed over time, because initially one of them has been the demand for Carrie Lam to step down. But this whole saga has been, intensifying, and we all know that realistically, even if she steps down, someone else would just come in and fill in her spot and, carry out the exact same agenda and probably would worsen the situation. So we've dropped that.
I know a critique that a lot of radicals have made in certain movements in Europe and in the United States, very small sections, but has been a refusal of demands because of the thing, for instance, that Carrie Lam did with the extradition bill, twice saying in different ways, oh yeah, no, that's totally off the board, but not actually having a way of promising that that's actually there. But yeah, I don't know if that's a limitation that people have experienced in terms of posing demands of authority, or if they're seen as reachable goals.
I think there's for sure varying degrees of reachability for the 5 different demands. Some highly unlikely, but some, for example, yes, the withdrawal is a quite simple response that could be made. And actually, we were just talking a bit earlier, and I think something that Enid said that I think is quite valid is that this is actually a very pragmatic kind of movement. I think one of the reasons why there can be such solidarity is because these 5 demands are very clear. And so it's very concrete what everybody needs to stand behind. Whereas it's not an ideological sort of battle, and therefore there are not these kind of clashes that you would have seen in the Occupy movement. And I think this kind of abstraction of a no demands, perhaps, yeah, maybe Hong Kong is not at that point yet. I would say definitely it's been much more effective to be clear in terms of the demands, and yet the tactics in which the ways in which people are going about that now have reached another kind of abstraction.
Do you think that there will be the effect that Carrie Lam is intending of diminishing pressure on the government from the movement by saying that there's a concession to that first, even if the legislature isn't currently in session and so it can't actually be acted upon at the moment? Or do you think that the movement will continue to be strong and resist until they get all 5?
I think right now, since we only have the first one down, and that's not even actually confirmed until the legislature or the council reopens, clearly what we see today, at least, is that the movement is still going on very strong. And actually, we just joined one of the more peaceful gatherings in Central, and numbers are rather high still. So I don't think her announcement has really affected the momentum of the movement as yet, but that may change if we get more demands met later. I think the major sort of division of factions that may happen is when the independent commission is established, which for now we don't really see that coming anytime soon, kind of telling from her statement 2 nights ago. But yeah, so for now the momentum is still very strong.
So at the end of August, a huge demonstration in Hong Kong took place in protest of the police and in support of women in the movement who were targeted by police use of sexual violence and intimidation. Can you talk a little bit about what happened and what the public response has been?
Yes, it was on August 28th. So last week there was a Me Too protest with I think there was around 30,000 participants, which is actually not so high compared to some of of course, you've seen millions come out on the street for some of the larger organized protests. But this organized by the Hong Kong Women's Coalition on Equal Opportunities was specifically, and we've seen a lot of protests sort of breaking out into other kinds of issues. So bringing the general large movement together with, for example, issues that are localized per district or per recent events. So, for example, what's happening tonight in Prince Edward is a specific response to the police attack on the 31st. And the Me Too protest was triggered from a protest on August 5th in which a young girl was taken away by police. And apparently there were 3 female police officers, as per the sort of ordinance that people are only supposed to be arrested or taken into custody by police officers of the same sex. So it was reported that there were 3 female officers that were trying to take hold of her, and she was sort of resisting, and so therefore 2 men were also called in to drag her away, and apparently she was resisting so much that she was wearing a dress, no? And,
yes, that was a long dress.
Her dress kind of got pulled up in the struggle there, and her panties somehow also got pulled down, and so revealing her private parts. And this was also, of course, like exposed to everyone around, and also recorded by the media and deemed as a highly inhumane act of sexual violence. So this, as well as another case in which a young protester who had been taken into custody and forced to undress, was apparently sort of strangely treated by the female police officers who had asked for the body search, including touching her or poking her with a pen in order to spread her legs, which of course is completely beyond protocol. These kind of events sort of created a huge public outrage, which led to that particular demonstration.
So demonstrations came up out of this, and officials reacted, I would imagine, and this is probably something that they're saying is going to be taken up by the IPCC. But how has, like, besides people going out and demonstrating in the street, like, I know that in the United States there are very frequent, it's also a very large country with a lot of police, but there are frequent experiences that are shared around people being sexually harassed by police in various states of custody, whether it just be on the street or in cop cars or at stations or in prisons. Is this a thing that people are aware of with the police forces in Hong Kong, like an existing problem?
Yes, I think one of the police stations, the one in Mong Kok, is kind of infamous for previous cases, although we, as citizens, we can hardly really get full details about what's happened in there because they've all been accusations and no concrete evidence. But sexual violence during custody is not a new thing, but they've always been done, behind doors. And I think this is the first time that we hear protesters being arrested and experiencing sexual violence. So in terms of social movements, I think this is the first case of sexual violence accusation.
Well, there are so many sort of rumors going around, and I would have to say that sort of sexual violence occurring at psychological levels happens on both sides of the line. So, yeah, for sure, even from the protester side, this is not, I guess, fact-check news. This is a rumor. I have to preface this, but I had heard also that there was a Telegram group created that was collating information, including addresses and details about the wives of policemen, as a way to talk about basically stealing the policemen's wives from the policemen.
Right? Yeah, or taking revenge on them.
Exactly, through the women. And I think this kind of tactic of using women as a sort of psychological scare tactic or kind of weakening point for protests is not something new either. And we've heard also similar stories from the police side, and you hear all sorts of kind of sexually violent terms being shouted all the time during the protests. And in some ways, actually, could even be said at some points it's reappropriated and become positive. So it's happening at many, many different levels. When I say positive, like the example that just comes to my head is the whole like Ziyao Hai thing, which
the whole what? I'm sorry.
There's a slogan called Ziyao Hai, which means basically like freedom. And this was actually recorded on live news where a policeman shouted this towards a protester who had kind of locked himself in a shopping mall because the policemen are not allowed to enter into the private space of the shopping mall. And so he was standing outside of the glass window and shouted this to the protester. And it's such a random, it's hard to translate it into English, like the kind of random mishmash of what this kind of term put together, because it hasn't really been used before in this way. Come on, like freedom. And so it's funny, but it's also, of course, appropriating the female genitalia in a way that has since then become a huge slogan for the protesters. So you've seen a lot of propaganda and T-shirts even being made and people wearing it in support of the protest, but as a way also to make fun of the police. That's
still constantly being built on like feminized body parts and like some sort of discomfort or disgust around that.
Well, I mean, it's a common swear word. I guess as would be used very easily and openly in British slang, perhaps. But what I mean here is that I think it has been actually appropriated in an empowering way, to be honest. That doesn't undermine all of this. There have been a lot of really horrible cases, like involving perhaps reported rapes of protesters. Also, what I said about the policeman's wife. So I'm just giving examples of how it's being used, or it's kind of filtering through the movement in different ways.
Mm-hmm. There's also another horrific rumor, and we have no way of fact-checking this, but a lot of people have been volunteering as drivers to pick up the more radical frontliners and sort of giving them a ride home safely. But there's been rumors going around that particular women have been picked up by these volunteer drivers and driven back to their own homes, to the drivers' homes, and they were consequently being raped on site. And because of this antagonism that exists between the protesters and the police, they are afraid to report these rapes. And so this is, I saw this yesterday, so this is still being fact-checked, but it is a possibility. And also people are saying that this also could be a tactic kind of thought up by the police to use this as another scare tactic, to scare particularly women from, joining the front lines.
Well, so this is the thing that was like, in my experience, I remember this coming up during the Occupy movement, like during the last, there were definitely like large-scale demonstration movements in the U.S. since then, but during that time when people were spending a lot of time in places and being conflictual with police, and like sleeping in public squares, this was the thing that was like used by police, the fact that assaults actually do occur, but police saying, look, these are unsafe places with unsafe people, we need to not support these movements. But at the same time, like, I can't say anything about the amount of assault that happens outside of the demonstrations and in normal day-to-day Hong Kong society. But how do feminists who are organizing around these movements like deal with the incipient patriarchy that exists in our societies as a whole? Is this a thing that there have been Me Too protests to address as well, or is that sort of fall under the banner or like under the category of critique of the movement would endanger our ability to conflict with law enforcement and have solidarity with each other? Because if that were the case, then it would be throwing more than half of the population under the bus.
Mm-hmm. I think that it would be interesting to look back at the example that happened on August 5th. Female protesters who wore the skirt to the front line and was subsequently, arrested in a very, very violent way. While she was in custody and nobody could have direct contact with her, the feminists and organizations who are concerned with sexual harassment, they came out immediately, and the day after they sort of organized around that particular police station that she's being locked up in. And after her release, she actually gave an interview with her own perspective, and she immediately clarified that she wasn't sure if actual sexual harassment took place because of the kind of frenzy that happened at the scene. So even as the quote-unquote victim, she was not sure if she was actually harassed at the scene, but it looked that way through via media portrayal. So this image enraged all the activists that are concerned for her. And she went on to say that although this could have been sexual violence, she didn't want this to be made into a very particular, separate headline, because she considers this as part of the general police brutality that is going on throughout the movement. So she sort of spoke in there's almost guilt in her voice, because she didn't want distraction from main concerns of the movement. And after this happened, there's a lot of online discussion about sexual violence and Me Too, because on a side note, Me Too hasn't really taken off in Hong Kong, really. There was a very famous incident where an athlete has been sexually harassed for a long time by her coach, and she's part of the sort of Hong Kong team. But that was the sort of only famous one that has really taken off. Most of the time, these possible cases do not go beyond the discussion of the victim's immediate family. And so this whole Me Too movement has never really taken off in Hong Kong. And while people are discussing this particular female protester and her, what's happened to her, there has been a lot of shaming, actually, but in a very indirect way, because they simply advise female protesters to stay away or, not take the frontline position, because once they are subjected to such sexual violence, there is a kind of media distraction. And because a lot of other, let's say, male protesters are eager to rescue her at the scene, and they're provoked by such sexual violence, more people get caught. This is what they claim. And so this sort of guilt is built into this general sentiment of wanting to protect female protesters. So within the movement itself, there is this kind of weird victim shaming. This is what we have seen
I think it's also interesting to note how, this sort of violence against bodies is something exactly that is spanning across all of the police brutality that's been happening. And very early on in June also, there were posters showing police grabbing male protesters by the crotch and dragging them on the ground. But this is not necessarily sort of labeled with as a sexually violent act. It's just violence, whereas violence or brutality against a woman is immediately regarded as, the female body. And so I think actually I find it very sort of self-aware of this young girl to consider it in that sense, that she did not want her particular case to be singled out as this sort of feminine victim aspect. It's still rampant, as it is maybe in everyday life everywhere, that certain things are regarded as female activities versus male activities, and those roles get divided even on the ground.
That's very well stated.
Girls in the back to move like goods, or move the material goods, and boys in the front to face with the shields. It's this kind. But actually, we do see a lot of women out there, but definitely, the number of women who are arrested is much less. For example, there have also been a lot of scares and worries because people are getting checked at the border between Hong Kong and Shenzhen. And for example, a friend of mine was traveling with a group of young Hong Kong people to China for a kind of camp trip just a few weeks ago. And when they were coming back into Hong Kong, all of the boys got stopped and their mobile phones checked for data and questioned by the police, whereas none of the girls get checked at all. So it's an age thing for one. I think they're profiling based on age, but also gender. And that actually I was quite surprised by. I hadn't expected that, but this is what our friends have told us.
I guess as messed up as that is, that could also work to people's advantage.
Yes, yeah. If you know that, then yes, you can there are always tactics. Right?
You're right, I'm not a threat. Totally not a threat. Just walk through your police. Yeah. While it's demeaning also. But it's kind of switching gears a little bit. In our prior interview on the subject with Akok, he talked about the political development among the protesters, saying that some of the movement was motivated by a racist sort of liberal populism as opposed to a more like liberatory decolonial movement or like agitation, focusing on, for instance, secondary violence going against people of Chinese descent who are in the city, and like popular violence against them as being a part of the problem somehow because they're connected, I guess, ethnically with Beijing, or a sort of like nativism around like Hong Kong for Hong Kongers, or the reappropriation of the prior colonial UK flag. Have you seen like a shift in consciousness around this movement, around concepts of independence or decolonization, or do you think that his observation was something that you've experienced as well?
I would agree with Akok. I don't think there is a shift, but I think we need to clarify that this movement began, like it was never centered on one ideology to begin with, because the demands were very practical. And so people who joined the movement were from different points on the spectrum. There are, as you said, the localist nativists, but also there are sort of left-leaning liberals who actually the nativists like to make fun of. They call them zhao gao, which is left plastic as in sort of the state of being stuck and sort of stuck in the ideals and not thinking pragmatically enough. So the left-leaning liberals are usually the ones that vouch for more peaceful protests, whereas the ones on the right, the localists and the nativists, they are mostly found on the front lines, and they think that without violence the movement will not move forward. And so I think the sort of percentages are roughly still the same throughout the movement. I don't think people have shifted in their own ideology. And we actually expected that. We expected some of the left-leaning liberals to sort of drop out and say, okay, since the first demand has been met, then let's stop the violence. But actually, because of months of police brutality, we're all very enraged. So I don't think people are ready to pull out yet.
I mean, I think there's also a very dark undercurrent of the anti-mainland sentiment. But of course, this goes way back further than the time period of this anti-extradition movement. And it has colored different protests in many different ways and affected a lot of the discourse, I guess, or sort of the relations in certain protests. For example, the ones that occur in more sensitive districts that have a lot of mainland tourists, for example, and they've been an extreme part of tension as well as conflicts. Some of the supposedly paid triad members are coming from clan groups in China. There's a lot of report that those groups are also paid by the Chinese, and even the media, of course, is always stressing, when there are certain sort of attacks occurring, if the attacker has a mainland accent. Those kind of distinctions are very prominently made in order to make that divide clear between what is Hong Kong and what is mainland or what is not Hong Kong. And that sort of need to sort of reassert a Hong Kong identity is also part of a much longer sort of issue that Hong Kong has had to face as a colonial city, and part of, I think, a much more deep-seated issue. And this protest in particular probably has been able to bring people together in light of that in so many ways. And so, yes, it can turn xenophobic, it can turn fascist in a lot of ways.
This is The Final Straw Radio, and I'm Burst. If you care to support this project monetarily, feel free to visit our website, thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and click the donate button. There You can find options for recurring payments through Patreon and the related thank you gifts that you can find there, or you can purchase t-shirts or stickers or buttons or whatever via our various web store presentations. So this is an anarchist radio show, and generally not everyone that we talk to obviously is anarchist on the show, or anti-authoritarian explicitly, but do you feel like there is much of a representation of a sort of like anti-authoritarian left non-pacifist position in the movement? Or because I know that like anarchists have been paying attention to what's been going on in Hong Kong, and a part of that internationally is because we think that conflict is necessary. Most of us think that conflict is necessary to bring about social change, and that it changes the society that's engaging in liberatory violence. Not to put all of the focus on violence, because violence is not how you build community. But not violence alone. But like, do you think that there is much of a representation of people that have affinity with anarchist ideas in the movement, or do you think that outside anarchist media just likes to put itself into whatever conflict zone it can, like to envision itself and its comrades being there?
I think most of the anarchists, at least the ones I know in Hong Kong, would rather not represent themselves so much, and they're not strictly using those kind of banners in terms of their presence in public, although they participate and support the movement in different ways. So I think there are many groups, different groups that have been out there, some probably participating more in direct action or in violence than others. But I don't think that, I think that even there's one group that actually just lost their space earlier this year that talk very much about how there are really no real leftists or even no real anarchists in Hong Kong. Although that group would probably be one of them. If you, they're called Autonomous 8A, and they would probably be one of them if you had to look for them in Hong Kong. But they're such a minority in terms of the general discourse that I don't really say they have a place, actually. Nor do they choose to emphasize their a label for the activities that they're doing.
So what do you think comes next? Do you think that, like, is China going to intervene if there's continued protests? Do you think that there's like room to grow for a more robust autonomous movement? And how do you think that listeners can keep informed and support the movement against these incursions by mainland while acting abroad?
When you say autonomous movement, do you mean movements that are organized autonomously, or do you mean movements for pushing for Hong Kong independence and autonomy itself?
More the prior, more movements that are organized autonomously, because I think that's, although I would love to hear about if how much you think of this is a push for autonomy for Hong Kong as opposed to like these specific demands.
The push for Hong Kong autonomy, I mean, you see that out there for sure. Even just today we passed by, there's now suddenly graffiti all over the city where it was never before, which is another interesting, I find a very interesting kind of visual output of the movement, to see how probably people who would have never engaged in that kind of activity, suddenly it's become very commonplace. And there's a lot of graffiti out there that talks about pushing for Hong Kong independence. Personally, I don't think that's realistic at all, considering how Hong Kong is so intertwined and completely dependent on China in so many ways. I mean, for example, even just water. Hong Kong also has one of the lowest food sovereignty rates in the entire world. We're completely dependent for food, water, air, everything, every resource. Basically, you cannot survive without China. So it would be so easily for them to, if they wanted to, they could pull the plug at any moment, economically, financially, everything. But I don't know, there's a myth maybe for that to exist out there. And I guess perhaps it's still a strong sort of affective, sort of emotional push that people are longing for in between the sort of weird, it's like a strange juxtaposition between being something that's future speculative, but also a weird nostalgia for what they imagine was the beautiful colonial past of being British. Which is a complete, it's exactly the sort of identity conflict that Hong Kong actually, in the end, doesn't know what it is, I think. Okay, in terms of autonomy of actions in the movement, this, I think, is very strong because of the fact that these young people, for example, you probably know that they're organizing a lot via online forums, and there's such an amazing form of quick, fast, flexible organization to do these small actions, whether it be, okay, a group of people gathering on the ground and saying, okay, here's the police front line, let's gather in a group of 6 and decide what we're going to do here and where we're going to go next, all of these things. And people being able in such tight moments, whether online or offline, or basically, I guess, the combination of both, being able to move incredibly flexibly. And that, I think, because it's small groups acting very in this way, I think it can continue for sure. As long as these young people have the energy, I think that will continue. And whether or not these kind of small flashes are able to sustain the general, that is, I guess, what is the question, perhaps, or something, a larger kind of change or action or movement, I'm not sure. But in terms of these particular things as they are happening now, I could see it continuing for quite some time.
And another interesting thing to point out is that a lot of the frontliners who are actually very young, they have not participated in the umbrella movement. They actually have a certain level of distrust towards sort of figureheads from the previous movement because of the sort of trauma of its failure. So when sort of established figureheads come out to talk or try to encourage organization or maybe act like they are figureheads of the current movement, a lot of young people at the front lines would kind of ridicule them because they want this to be to remain anonymous, fast organizations without any central decision figure, and to have major sort of strategies devised on scene and not even on Telegram, because they stress that the police has also infiltrated Telegram groups. So a lot of the decisions are made on scene where people can sort of feel out who is actually a protester or who could possibly be police posing as protesters. So it's a very flexible style of organization, and it's always changing, and no one is really leading or representing any event.
I guess one more technical question that I had is a lot of people have been talking about the use of the lasers during demonstrations, and I know that those are a thing that, I mean, they're beautiful to watch, but also they were present, like similarly used in Greece in 2008 and 2009 and subsequent demonstrations during Arab Spring, and in like Cairo, like during the uprisings in Egypt. Can you say anything about what those are, where they come from, sort of like what you know about them?
Well, I think it started out as people trying to find non-physical, like non-violent ways of distracting the police.
The police also use really bright lights, both to blind the protesters, but also to make it difficult for media to photograph because of the lights blocking out, visibility. And so, the protesters started with a tactic to shine these lasers at the police.
Mm-hmm. But I think its function has moved beyond this practical use of sort of distraction and defense on site, but because ever since the police claimed that this is quote-unquote lethal or very damaging.
It's a weapon.
Yeah, they classify it as a weapon, and so people started gathering and doing sort of scientific experiments as in how lethal this could be. And there were peaceful gatherings all across the city to shine various lasers into a single point and see whether this could, let's say, set a piece of paper on fire. And, you could not really do that with the power of lasers that these different protesters own. So it kind of evolved into not a directly practical tactic on site, but a sort of kind of reflection. And I think
the one big laser party that happened a few weeks ago at the Space Museum was also in solidarity because the student union head of Hong Kong Baptist University was arrested. Not Yamada, in Sam Sui Po. He was arrested in one neighborhood that is known for selling cheap electronics, and the police found, 10 laser pointers in his bag and arrested him because of this. And so people were in solidarity and also, making fun of the sort of absurdity of a laser pointer suddenly becoming, classified in such a dangerous lethal weapon sort of manner. Mm-hmm. And that was how that particular event got organized. And there was even actually one of these laser parties tonight. And I think that's the interesting stuff. So even just tonight, there were 3 different public events listed. There's a schedule. It's very organized. A schedule every week that they call the Hong Konger schedule, and you can see sort of which protests and where, and ones that are officially sanctioned and approved by the police and some are not. And so they sort of word them in different ways. But tonight, there was a laser party in one neighborhood. There was an officially sanctioned rally against white terror and police brutality. And then there was also the medical...
800 medical workers gather at the lobby of the Hospital Authority building. So all these different gatherings, but let's say and in particular for the events like the laser party, there's a very particular function to it where we kind of gather and make fun of what's happened. And I think humor is very important throughout this movement because everyone is so stressed out and, desperately trying to find ways not to be too depressed by just, continuously escalating violence. So we had to find some way or excuse to gather and make fun of what's happened. So, the laser having been a kind of talking point, but not actually extremely practical on site as a tool, became a joke and a reason to gather and to sort of de-stress.
That one was also not sanctioned by the police, right?
I
think that's another. It's also a tactic in a way. There was a traditional festival where they used gathering for this traditional Chinese festival as a reason to gather because you don't need to have a police approval if it's for religious reasons. So these are also become tactics of the protesters in order to have the ability to gather at all. So one may be a party. That's also interesting what I meant by this 3 different events, which reflect such a diverse sort of spectrum in terms of professions and classes and even, feeling in terms of the ways that people are approaching this.
The way that people, blow off steam with each other and also like gather for pleasure, like that in and of itself is kind of an insurrectional thing and rebellious, especially if things have to be sanctioned. I guess in any city where there's police, there's going to be parties that are going to be broken up for too many people gathering in a space or being disorderly or whatever. But that's really awesome to hear about the sort of social reproduction element of like getting together for this thing to just like have a laugh.
I think, because the protests have, unlike, for example, the Occupy movement, where basically it lost steam because it alienated ordinary citizens, because you're basically blocking off business of not only the rich, but also of everyday working class. You're not, because the streets were occupied, people lost business, they were not able to go to work, and therefore, it lost steam among a greater kind of solidarity that it could have had. Whereas this one has sort of been flashing in bursts. Like for most of the summer, most of the protests only happen on the weekends. And something I find really interesting is that it grew this kind of culture of protest, of being a weekend protester. And I think all of us in different ways have had to deal with, and how do we reflect this sort of identity or our participation in this movement with the fact that our everyday lives are having to maintain your job anyway, having to do your 9-to-5 work, how those things need to actually go together has been like a really critical question for me, and I think for a lot of people that is incredibly sort of eye-opening in terms of how we need to reflect the sort of our sociopolitics with actually the basic question of how we want to live our lives, right? And that is something I really sort of admire about, I don't know, maybe the challenge of what I have had to face. Not that admire is not the right word. I should say, I guess what it's been for me a big struggle actually, but it's been something that I'm so amazed and I learned so much in terms of seeing how other people are dealing with this, or how we've had to put these things together in ways that I haven't experienced before.
Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you would like to share and like for listeners out there to hear about and know about what's been going on in Hong Kong?
Oh, I think one thing we didn't really touch upon is in terms of Chinese intervention. And, when we talk about this, we always think of, the involvement of the army, whether they're going to cross the border, but there's actually a lot of intervention already happening in the financial sectors, and how Hong Kong companies are made up of in terms of investments, because you see that a lot of bigger corporations, most notably Cathay Pacific, the airline that is based in Hong Kong, they have been responding very quickly to the sort of threats from the central government, and laid off a lot of people who have been part of the protests without a kind of fair trial before, laying off. And this is because the company over the years has been receiving increasing investments from mainland interests, and now it is, I think in terms of stockholder breakdown, 40-something% is owned by an airline company in mainland, and which is linked to the government. And so they have been expressing their concerns and demands, and sort of putting pressure to sort of clear out or lay off anyone that has been explicitly involved in the movement. So this kind of pressure is very immediate and real, and this would spread a lot of white terror very quickly. And this style of intervention is, happening on a day-to-day basis. And this sort of fear is actually more effective than,
I think the threat of, tanks coming in is probably, it's much more glamorous, but much more unlikely to happen.
Yeah, because people at the front line have been, saying that they are not afraid of the army crossing the border. They would just stay home if, when martial law is going to be in effect. They would not be scared. They would just, hide out and, come out and organize flexibly. But when it comes to jobs, this fear is way more intense. And so I think Chinese influence on this level has been very effective.
Also, thank you so much for having this. I don't know how comfortable you are in English. You both speak very clearly and seem to have like a really awesome grasp on it. So I don't know if you were like raised speaking English or not, but thank you very much for being willing to do the taxing work of speaking a maybe not native language.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you also for your work with this. I have no idea sometimes about how relevant this issue is or how pertinent it is on the international level, and so And I actually most often have a real disdain for media. Of course, I know that you're not real like an official media outlet or anything, but in terms of having the responsibility to translate. But I guess in this particular case, I feel that I want to try as best as I can to get the message in terms of what is happening here out to other people, because I guess it is also the fact that Hong Kong is so importantly intertwined with what's happening on a global level that I hope that other people can know the issue. So I'm really appreciative of your interest, and thank you.
Yeah, of course, and thank you for the opportunity. Well, so for people that are out there and want to keep up and are interested in learning more and about these issues, are there any news sources in English that you would suggest that people pay attention to?
I think there's one news outlet called Hong Kong Free Press that is quite extremely active. And again, with my disdain for medium, for the most part, I've actually been so impressed with the work of the media in terms of this movement, because they're really out there day and night working. And Hong Kong Free Press is actually a really very small team of people, but extremely active and I would say reliable in terms of their English language broadcasting. So you can check that.
And also South China Morning Post, which a lot of people have actually noticed in terms of investment influence. It could be,
it's owned by Alibaba.
Right. But if you want sort of general overview of, day-to-day changes or happenings, it's the major English newspaper in Hong Kong. But, everyone should compare and analyze.
There's also a Telegram. And for those of people who are out there on Telegram and not afraid to be blasted by an incessant flurry of posts, there's a Telegram group that I think anyone can join called Guardians of Hong Kong, that does translated posts from a lot of other Chinese language Telegram groups, selected English translations, as well as sort of on live updates, especially during protests, but also, yes, as I said, translation of press releases and other kind of information. And that group is called Guardians of Hong Kong. I think you can search it.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Thank you, Enid and Rebecca, both for having this chat and taking the time. I hope you get really good sleep. And also, let folks know that people on the outside are paying attention and care a lot and are inspired by the strength of the movement in Hong Kong.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
This is The Final Straw, and I'm William Goodenough. The show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions or suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at The Final Straw, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned cooperative in Asheville, specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a sample of Firestorm's catalog of books and zines, plus a full calendar of events at their website, firestorm.coop.
Mercy. Thank you.